Hi everybody, it's week 8 of History 310 and I'm Professor Messner and lot of ground that's covered this week. So as usual, I wanted to give you a little bit of an insight or some highlights as to what's coming up, okay, in terms of your reading. We're finishing chapter 18 this week, and it kind of is a sad ending to this chapter because it gives an idea about how unsuccessful the initial attempts at reform were. Part of that was the disorganization of groups like the Populists, and part of it was simply because the SP was just too powerful. So at the end of chapter 18, if that were the end of the story, you might get the impression that all was lost because the SP is still entrenched in spite of the fact that their reputation has been tarnished in a lot of ways. So chapter 18 does not end very optimistically. Chapter 19 in some ways is even more pessimistic because they're talking about the abuse of cheap labor. Some people have called it the slavery institution of California, is cheap migrant labor. And when I say that, I'm not necessarily talking about Latino or Hispanic labor. I'm talking about just migrant labor, could be Anglo, could be Hispanic, but in any case, it is the basis of a lot of the California ag economy, and you're going to be reading a lot about that. You're also going to be seeing how groups like the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, or the Wobblies, tried to organize them, and their efforts culminated in something called the Wheatland Riot, which was in 1913. And this breaks out in violence, and it illustrates that if you are an agricultural laborer in California in the early part of the 20th century, you're really living a bad deal. Bad conditions, worse pay, no chance to have any sort of collective bargaining. The AFL certainly didn't want to have anything to do with you. Even the CIO didn't take on farm workers at that particular time. So it's really a bad deal. And so you're going to be learning about that more in chapter 19. Chapter 20, things begin to be shaken up, and I use the term shaken up advisedly because this chapter talks about the 1906 earthquake and the fire that followed that, which was the thing that really did most of the damage in the city and county of San Francisco and elsewhere, but certainly principally in that area. Then it talks about something that has not really been discussed all that much by scholars, and that is the graft prosecution of 1906 and 1907. And the reason that that's important is that it is an expose of the corrupt practices that are happening in California cities, and in particular San Francisco. And in the wake of the earthquake, it's important that we look at that. And so what I'll be asking you to do, one of our objectives for this week, is that you understand the connection between the results of the earthquake and the graft prosecution, which is led by Hiram Johnson. And this really puts Hiram Johnson on the minds of many politicians, and in particular Republican progressives, because they're going to turn around and elect the man in 1910 as governor. So I really want you to pay attention to people like Abraham Roof, who was basically the boss of San Francisco politics at that time. Pay attention to him, his role, and the kind of things that the political machine in San Francisco did. Well, you only get a little piece of chapter 21 in this week's reading, but you're going to get an idea of how at long last there is some major government reform that's happening in California under Hiram Johnson and people like him. And the rest of chapter 21 is going to be discussing that in particular. Now, you got some of it in the abstract in other chapters, reforms that had happened, but those were basically at a local level. So what you're going to see as we get into chapter 21 is how those reforms begin to go statewide. All right. Happy reading. If you have any questions, please get a hold of me. I'll see you at office hours or at conference.